Hi everyone, my name is Wensheng. It is my honor to be here to do a presentation to express some economic concepts to all of you. The first question is about the social welfare related to the consumption tax. Figure 1 shows us an equilibrium situation without government tax. For example, free trade when the supply and demand curves intersect at the equilibrium point. The shaded triangles on the left side of the figure shows us what happens to consumer and producer surplus, respectively. When the government imposes a consumption tax, the supply curve shifts to the left. Since the demand curve is not shifted, the supply and demand curve intersect further to the left at this point. By comparing the image with the one without the tax, we can see that both producer and consumer surplus are reduced by the presence of the tax. At the same time, due to the tax leverage on the government, an improvement in government's welfare occurs while consumer and producer welfare incurs a loss. However, after comparing these components, we find that the loss in producer and consumer welfare is greater than the improvement in government welfare due to the tax. In other words, from the perspective of society as a whole, there is a reduction in welfare compared to what it was before the tax was levied. For example, a net welfare loss, which is also referred to as a needless loss, and which is shaded in the graph on the right to denote the DWL. The DWL is therefore the reduction in society's overall welfare due to the government's taxing behavior. About these questions, look at the left graph. The three supply curves in the above graph are from left to right. The supply curves when the first line is there is only domestic trade and no international trade. The second line is the supply curves when international trade is carried out on the conditions of import duties. The third line is the supply curves when free international trade is carried out under conditions of no tariffs. We can see from the graph that in the case of only domestic trade, the equilibrium point at this point is higher in price and lower in equilibrium quantity due to the smaller number of suppliers. In the case of free trade without tariffs, the large supply of foreign goods will shift the supply curves to the right, and the equilibrium point will be at a point where the equilibrium quantity is large and the equilibrium price is low. At this point, domestic producer would be challenged, and the profits of the domestic industry would fall sharply. The government generally imposes an import tax to protect the domestic industry. After the tax is imposed, the supply curve shifts to the left as the price of import goods rises. Nonetheless, the supply curves at this point flatten out to the right compared to a domestic trade-only supply curve due to the complementary presence of foreign goods. However, compared to free trade, the supply curve is shifted to the left. At this point, the government gains tax revenue due to the import tariff. However, upon comparison, we still found that the area of decrease in producer surplus and consumer surplus is still larger than the area of increase in government tax revenue. For example, a netless loss is incurred in the case of import tariff. In this graph, we use the area of triangle F and G to represent DWL. Before participation in international trade, the total domestic surplus is A plus B plus D. After participation in international trade, in absence of the tax, the total domestic surplus is A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G. At this point, domestic supply is S1, domestic demand is D1, and imports are D1 S1 because domestic supply is less than demand. After the imposition of the tariff, domestic supply increases as a result of the increase in the price of the goods, S1 to S2, and the price increase reduce consumption from D1 to D2. Since the domestic supply can only supply S2 quantity of the goods, imports are D2 S2. Before the imposition of the tariff, the consumer surplus is A plus B plus C plus E plus F plus G in the diagram, and the producer surplus is D in the diagram. After the imposition of the tariff, consumer surplus is in area A plus C. The producer surplus is in area B plus D, and the government tax revenue is in E in the diagram. At this point, area G and F are loose due to the imposition of the import tax, producing DWL. Although needless losses are incurred in the same way as domestic excise tax, the source of the needless losses are different. When there is all-in domestic trade, needless losses come from producer and consumer surplus of domestic producer and consumers. In the case of the import tariff, however, all-in consumer surplus is lost. Since tariff all-in affected the price of the import goods, the reduction in supply comes entirely from the imports. Domestically, producer gain more producer surplus as the equilibrium market price rises. Thus, the welfare loss under the condition of imposing an import tax is borne by both foreign producer and the domestic consumers, while domestic producer generate a welfare improvement. When a tariff is imposed, the quantity of the imports decreases in favor of the consumption of more domestic products. Essentially, inefficient domestic production is substituted for the efficient foreign production, thereby supporting domestic industry and reducing imports for foreign products. About the question 3, the economic equilibrium is at point A when the government has not imposed a tax. At this point, the government begins to impose the tax that improves people's health. In short run, as the tax reduces the amount of goods that people's incomes can buy, reducing aggregate demand, the AD1 curve shifts to the left to AD2, and economic equilibrium is at point B. At this point, output is less than the level of natural production. In the long run, because the reduction in aggregate demand caused price to fall. Reducing the price level, the short-run supply curve shifts to the right, SRS1 to SRS2, and the economic ends up in long-run equilibrium at point C. At point C, output remains at the natural output level, but the price falls from P0 to P2. In the long run, the policy of increasing the consumption tax will only cause price to fall, and not cause an increase in output, which will remain in equilibrium at level of the natural production. For example, the economic will only move along the long-run supply curve, LRS. About the question 4, based on the analysis of the ADS model, in the long run, a tax that improves people's health will reduce the supply of and the demand for these products in the long run. But it will not change the total output of the society, so the government will be able to steer the structure of the economic through the consumption tax. Consumption tax will have a substitute effect on the tax products, and consumers will switch to other products that meet their need, thus improving the health of the population and generating tax revenue for the government economically. There are long-term benefits in terms of economic welfare for the government and in terms of restructuring consumer spending. About these questions, according to the directed acyclic graph, the healthcare policy introduced by the government include the fat tax, which will reduce the consumption of unhealthy food, which will have a potential long-term impact on people's health. At the same time, the fat tax will restructure production, leading producers to produce less unhealthy food and in turn produce more healthy food. It can lead to an increase in people's life expectancy, which further affect economic growth. Therefore, we build econometric model to verify the effect of fat tax on health, life expectancy, and the effect of fat tax on economic growth. In the first of these equations, we use life expectancy as a measure of health, and we assume that life expectancy will be affected by gender underlying disease, fat tax, and other factors. For example, the arrow term. We will collect the data from the hospital and enter a series of data into Stata for regression analysis, making the hypothesis that H0 to beta 1 equals 0. For example, fat tax does not affect health. Set the significance level alpha at 0.05 and run the data through Stata. Observe the result of the t-test and the magnitude of the p-value. If the p-value is less than 0.05, then we reject the original hypothesis, stating that there is a significant effect of fat tax and life expectancy. If the p-value is greater than 0.05, then we accept the original hypothesis, which means that there is no significant effect between fat tax and life expectancy. In the second equation, we use the GDP growth rate as a measure of economic growth, and we hypothesize that the GDP growth rate is affected by the size of the population, technology advanced, the obesity tax and other facts, for example, the error term. We obtained the data from the Office for National Statistics website and formulated the hypothesis H0 to beta 1 equals 0. For example, fat tax and economic growth are not significantly correlated. Again, the significance level was set at 0.05, and this data were entered into Stata and run. Observe the result of the t-test after the run and the value of the p-value. If the p-value is less than 0.05, we reject the original hypothesis H0, which states a significant correlation between fat tax and economic growth. If the p-value is greater than 0.05, then we accept the original hypothesis. There is no significant relationship between fat tax and economic life expectancy.